Special council meeting to order for the hearing the proposal of Fishbeck. If there's anybody here for BZA, anybody at all here for BZA, because they're meeting down below. So if you're here for BZA, this is not going to be your hearing. Okay. All right. With that being said, why don't we just do a quick roll call? Just going to go down the list here. I'll just start the roll call here myself. I know we have Councilman Coolman.
Yeah, here.
Councilman Fuller.
Here.
Councilman Weber.
Here.
Councilwoman Materney.
Here.
Councilman McCarthy.
Here.
Councilman Van Duzen.
Here.
All right, everyone can please stand and say the pledge. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. I know there's several members of the public here that are looking forward to hear this presentation from Steve Whale with Fishbeck regarding some ADA improvements that a plan that we had made. So hopefully, Steve, if you'd like to come up and just introduce yourself and just jump right in.
Okay. Thank you. As Jonathan mentioned, my name is Steve Way. I'm a professional engineer in Ohio, focus on transportation, safety, and land development type projects. And here to represent Fishbeck on this assignment. Before I begin, I wanted to just let you know
Can you use that microphone? Maybe just bring it up on your podium there. There you go.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Can you hear it? Oh, you can't hear it.
I'm old.
So I've prepared remarks here. This presentation runs about 40 minutes in length. Prepared to run through it. I've covered a lot of the topics. If you just kind of hold your questions until the end, it'll help me stay on point and use our time most efficiently here. So overall, that's the outline that I plan on covering today. I was asked to share a little bit about Fishbeck, who we are, what we do, that sort of thing. So I'll start off with that. And then the background. There was some work that the city commissioned prior to Fishbeck's involvement on this assignment. I'll just review that with all of you to make sure that we're all starting at the same platform here on our knowledge base. Then I'll get into scope of work, not only what we did, but what the city asked us to perform, and how we executed the contract, which ultimately came to our recommendations here in the report that was submitted. We also, toward the end, I'll mention additional considerations. There are a number of additional items that the city may choose to implement. As I was working through the study here with the engineering department, those became evident that depending on how we would like to proceed with the project, there's a number of things that could be considered. So a little bit about Fishbeck to kind of establish who we are. Fishbeck is a firm that was founded in 1956. We have 14 offices, over 500 professionals. We're through the center of the quote there. We're organized into 4 divisions. We have an architecture and engineering division, which typically deals with the vertical space, buildings, municipal buildings, as well as private buildings. We have an infrastructure division, which that division is one that I belong to. That's where transportation people are, our water, wastewater people. The municipal engineering group, it functions under that. That's the group that was commissioned to execute a majority of the work of this assignment. Environmental, as well as a very small construction management type division itself. As I mentioned with the infrastructure, you kind of see there is a snapshot of the different capabilities within that infrastructure division. The transportation and traffic, municipal engineering, and surveying all played a role in the work that led to our report for this assignment. So, as a means of background, work that I'm aware the city performed prior to Fishbeck being involved in this assignment really had to do with an accessibility survey that was published by Disability Access Consultants in October of 2019. They performed a survey of the 2 blocks of Louisiana that we're talking about, and also issued a report, copy that I have here if you're interested. But they went through and developed a lot of the deficiencies that were noted within this corridor. They also went so far as to provide an estimate of costs for some of the items that they were recommending. That report served as the background for the City of Perrysburg's RFQ that was issued, in which Fishbeck, amongst others, responded to in the fall of 2021. So when Fishbeck responded to the city's RFQ, it really asked us to perform these 4 primary work items that you see in the slide. It asked initially to review the findings of Disability Access Consultants to confirm that we were generally in agreement with the findings that they presented. It further then asked us to go a step further and perform a more in-depth deficiency survey that would focus on dimensions, would focus on the cross slopes of the sidewalks, a variety of more technical aspects than what the first report had dealt with. Our deficiency survey was to focus on the traversable path. It was focusing, we were asked to focus on the public right-of-way alone. So from building facade to building facade. Our contract was not to perform any sort of architectural renovations and how the buildings might be modified with any work in front of it. It was also not to look at the access beyond the public right-of-way, which in this case was the actual building line itself. So that's what we did. We were focusing on just public right-of-way. We were also asked to look at the parking, and specifically the diagonal parking that's along these 2 blocks, and how the accessible parking spots could be modified to bring them up to current accessible standards. As a result of all that field data, we were then asked to develop 2 different geometric design concepts. One we considered more of a base option that would be more or less a minimalistic approach to dealing with the accessible issues that were on the corridor. And then more, the second option, which we called an advanced option, dealt with, they went into much greater depth on some of these items. With those two geometric design concepts, our fourth and final work item was to prepare budget estimates that the city could utilize. If they chose to go forward with the project, there would be funding that would be needed and implemented. So with the accessibility study, our first task was to review the accessibility study document that had been performed and submitted to the city in the fall of 2019. What they concluded here, disability access consultants, they concluded these 8 primary categories. Detectable warning devices at ramps, in some instances were missing, other instances did not comply with current standards. Those are the tannish bumps that you see on the crosswalks that assist with a visually impaired person to actually find where they're about ready to step out into the road. We have several instances on the Louisiana corridor where those are not in position currently. Roadway cross slopes at the parking. So you're required for an accessible parking spot to have a 2% maximum longitudinal grade in there. In many of our instances, that longitudinal slope exceeds 5% and in some cases almost 8%. And they identified that, and we also confirmed that in our work. Walkway, another term that you'll hear later on in my presentation is traversable path. For our purposes here, the walkway is the area that is intended to be the primary thoroughfare for the pedestrian on the sidewalk. It does not mean the entire sidewalk width. Okay, and I'll get into that in a minute. That's an important distinction. But in disability access consultants' work, they noted vertical differentials. Okay, the difference between sidewalk pieces that exceeded the 1/4 inch allowable differential. Cross slope and longitudinal slopes exceeded the 2% and the 5% respectively for those elements as well. The vertical differential to adjacent properties, a few of the photos and their report, you can kind of see they say in the finding there is a step or curb on the path of travel preventing access, and they're recommending that a ramp or other means of vertical access be provided. That was their conclusion to this specific property. Fishbeck concurs with that finding. Drainage, pavement markings, the walkway cross slope at alleys. We have a couple of alleys that penetrate the walkway. What has happened in this case is that we have a constant slope between the curb line of the road and where it hits grade back beyond the sidewalk itself. What this is driving towards is that typically we would have an allowable cross slope in the sidewalk area, and then you would have 2 slopes on either side of the alley itself. We found that to be the case and would confirm that as well. And then utility structures within the ramps, they identified in many locations we have like manhole covers, utility handholds, things like that are right in the area where the crosswalks and the truncated domes or the detectable warning device, where those are located. And that also is a violation of current standards. So with that review completed, Fishbeck went out and we performed our own survey in a much more comprehensive fashion. We had the benefits of disability access consultants' work. We went out there, myself and another engineer, and we did an inventory of the entire 2-block corridor. Furthermore, we employed one of our pieces of equipment that we use, which is called a terrestrial scanner. So we were able to scan not only the horizontal surface of all the sidewalk and provide a heat map on where the differentials were, right? So I could tell you with a pretty high degree of certainty where we had those steps that exceeded a 1/4 inch, where we had a settlement of a piece of sidewalk that was causing a pond, you know, a small puddle of water, say, for instance. And you can see an example there, fairly right outside of the Swig establishment, where there's a pond or a small puddle that's sitting right adjacent to that tree grate. That's an example of where the sidewalk is settled a little bit over time, and there's no mechanism where that water can leave that area. Not obviously going to go through all the items that we confirmed, but a couple that are bolded here on my slide. Detectable warning devices. The disability access consultants, they did identify one area that they deemed as a deficient detectable warning device, which I'm in disagreement with. And it actually is a portion of the sidewalk that crosses a larger driveway. It's not my recommendation that we should proceed with putting detectable warning devices there. I think, in my opinion, that is not considered a public thoroughfare, therefore it wouldn't be required. And I think my opinion is that if the city were to go in that direction, it's setting a bad precedent for future crossings like that, not only in downtown, but also throughout the city itself. Number 9 is one that I wanted to put on here also. It isn't directly related to the accessibility, but I think it is important to recognize in the larger trees and the tree planting areas are much larger than you would typically expect in an environment such as Louisiana. And because of that, it's posing additional constraints on what we could do within the sidewalk to make the area accessible. And I wanted to put that on the list to make sure that all of you understood that even though we're focusing on, you know, the vertical differentials of the walk, we did take a wider look and, okay, now what is the real constraints that are going on? I'm going to share with you in a few slides a couple of examples where the problem is over here, but the solution is over here. And you know, that's an example of just kind of going a little bit beyond the basics to try to arrive at a solution. The cross section there, we have roughly 25.5 feet of sidewalk area between the curb line and the building facade. The typical section is symmetric. You also have 11 foot, we call multi-directional left turn lane that provides access for that. This section provides a lot of opportunities and you know, could also be used to our advantage should the city decide to move forward. So when we talk about a comprehensive deficiency survey, I felt it was important, since I know there's a lot of interest in in these ramps and also in the accessible paths. These are two exhibits that I took from the U.S. Access Board to the ADA accessibility standards. And it focuses here to provide a little bit of information that you may not already be aware of. On the, in the left side, curb ramps along accessible routes. So this would apply to our crosswalks. This would apply to ramps leaving an accessible parking spot. This would apply to a ramp that we might choose to enter into a public, one of those adjacent buildings, both public or private. What I wanted to draw your attention to in this exhibit is a couple of things. One, the top landing. So we often think of the ramp, but we don't think about the landing or the sidewalk area that the ramp adjoins. One of the requirements there is that you have to have a flat area on top of that, so that somebody that's using this ramp, they actually have a place to, an area to rest, to make their movement decisions. It also helps quite a bit with making sure that you have clean lines, right? You have 90-degree corners so that you don't have a landing that's part on the side flare and part on the sidewalk. The other thing that's important about this exhibit is the terms running slope and cross slope. A running slope, and a lot of times you might hear me say longitudinal slope because it's easier for me, but a running slope or longitudinal slope is in the direction of primary traffic, okay? And you're allowed to use like they say here, a 1-on-12 maximum. There are provisions in the alterations there to the left. There are provisions where you can tighten that up for short distances and for smaller vertical rises. The cross slope, the 1 to 48, is generally accepted as 2%. On the exhibit to the right, this is an example of the sections that are applicable to accessible routes, and primarily to building entries that are along the accessible route. And so a couple of items here that I felt were important. The top one, doors, doorways, and gates along accessible routes and to accessible spaces must comply, right? So it's not an either or, it's an and. You need to do both. To the right, the upper right, vertical access. If you have a change in vertical elevation greater than 1/2 inch, it must be spanned. You must get over that by a ramp, a curb ramp, which is to the right or to the left there, or an elevator to accomplish that goal. In the gray area there, limited changes in level. So we have several instances where the disability access consultants indicated that the vertical differential was 3/8 of an inch, and they marked that as deficient. Okay, which it is, because it exceeds the 1/4 inch that you're allowed to have for a vertical differential. However, what this section allows for is that you can grind that corner. Say you're at 1/2 inch, you can grind that corner down so that you have a 1/4 inch vertical, and then you have a beveled edge. That's perfect. That's allowed based on the standards. So you may have seen where you'll have sidewalks, and there'll be a slight differential between sidewalk pieces, and you may see where we've gone in there and ground that surface. That's really what we're attempting to comply with there. We want that sidewalk to maintain its function as an accessible route, but we also recognize that we can't have a vertical differential of greater than that 1/4 inch. The last item that it talks about the clear widths, 36 inches, 32 inches on doorways. I mentioned earlier that our scope wasn't to look at the actual building itself, so I didn't take measurements to doorways and things. I don't know where we stand on some of those. We may have doors that are narrower than 32. We may have many that were much greater than that. I can't comment on the building itself. That wasn't what we were contracted to do. So, I apologize, my photos are a little dark, but you have the handouts, maybe you can see them there. So basically, after these are the results of our survey that we performed. Not only did we look at all of the vertical, but this the mapping that you see behind there is a result of the scanning work that we completed. In the lower left, I summarized what our Fishbeck's findings were. Like I said, many of these were in agreement with what the disability consultants had come up with earlier. But as a means of scale, 26 ramps within the 17 of 26 ramps within the corridor were non-compliant. 51 of 67 entryways were non-compliant from a vertical differential standpoint. The walkway, which is outlined in the red text there, the traversable path, the walkway, for a majority of its length on both sides of the road, was non-compliant, primarily based off from that cross slope of 2% and that longitudinal slope of 5%. In just about every section of it, that became an issue. The outdoor dining areas, there's several of them in the section of town. There were several locations where the outdoor dining areas were in conflict with the traversable path. You can kind of see one in this example, number 4 there on the right side. And, our survey picked up the railing that is out in front of what was formerly Casa Baron. They're no longer functioning that currently. But in that case, you see the darker stipple pattern there, where their railing overlapped the traversable path. 6 of the 8 parking spots, they don't show up on this, they'll show up on the next slide. But 6 of the 8 accessible parking spots were non-compliant, primarily from a perspective of the longitudinal slope that I talked about before. In a couple instances, there was also drainage issues that resulted in ponding at the ramps that was also an issue. The crosswalks, 2 of 10 crosswalks in the corridor were non-compliant. These, although they were non-compliant, these were really just fine details. It was how the striping, the actual crosswalks were painted. I wouldn't consider that to be a major non-compliance item, but we were charged to identify all of the non-compliant items, and the geometry of the crosswalks, how they interface with the detectable warning devices, the alignment between the crosswalk and the curb, all of that factors into being a compliant system. And then the improper drainage. We picked up a lot of areas in our survey where, and you see I got number 7 there in that concrete island, where you may have had 1 or 2 sidewalk pieces that had settled over time. There's some utility work that maybe the utility didn't get backfilled correctly and it settled a little bit in that area. One of the reasons that I went out there a couple of different times, but I purposely went out a couple hours after a pretty good rainstorm and walked, and just, that's how I got some of those photographs that showed the ponding on the surfaces. And in my opinion, ponding water in August and September becomes ponded ice and things of that nature later on. So it was an area that we focused on in that assessment. You'll also see that we have in this picture green dots, yellow dots, red dots, and orange dots along the photographs. And if I could draw your attention to the legend down below, what we were attempting to do, because we had so much data, that I was trying to come up with a way that we could quantify what we had and try to figure out how we could kind of capture all of this work. So the green you see there is 0 to ½ an inch. That's that same ½ inch where we could just grind a little bevel on there and be on our way. So so for green, I say no work required. That's basically what that is. It's very simple to get us into compliance. Yellow, orange, and red, those weren't arbitrary figures. With the ½ inch to 3 inches, what we were planning, and ended up, you'll see this in some of our recommended graphics, 3 inches was what we calculated was the maximum vertical differential that we could achieve in that area right adjacent to the building facade. So if we were able to take a 5% running slope and run up to the building, we could get about that 3% number. So when I saw yellow dots around all these doors, what I interpreted is, hey, that's a fairly easy, minimal, correction that we can do. When we got into in excess of 3 inches, we got to 3 to 8, and then in a few locations we have even greater than 8, which just as a quick aside, greater than 8 inches is also taller than what the Ohio Building Code would require for a stair riser. So typically you see risers 7 inches, 7.5. When you start getting into 8, 9, 10, that starts becoming very uncomfortable to navigate and relatively unsafe. Couple other items, just show you in this case here all along Cellos and Zingos and that area, coming up to Front Street. All of these entries were in that orange category. So after we had all this data, then I came through and I was trying to figure out, okay, so what do we do with the data? How do we go forward with this? How do we come up with some design criteria that we can utilize to create recommended solutions to all of this item. So I tried to summarize kind of side by side when we were going through this, what was our philosophy behind the different options. And you kind of see on concept number 1 there, sorry to talk behind you. The concept number 1, the base design, we were dealing with isolated ramps and landings. We were treating each of the entries that had a deficient vertical differential kind of on its own merit, right? We weren't trying to combine multiples. We weren't trying to we were trying to minimize the amount of work that was needed to just address the specific ADA accessibility item. We also focused on a 5-foot width for the traversable path. Coincidentally, what you have out there now is 6 feet, okay? 5 foot is the minimum that most people would apply to these sorts of situations. And it really drives to 2 wheelchair-bound individuals being able to pass each other without leaving that traversable path, where by definition, you could have slopes that are larger than the 1/4 inch per foot or 2% cross slope. Important to note that with item 2 in the base design, we were attempting to maintain all of the outdoor dining areas. We were attempting to avoid all of the tree grates and tree planting areas, street lights, all of that sort of thing, unless it was physically impossible to do so. So in doing that with the base design, what you end up with is a traversable path that kind of jogs around all these obstructions, because you can't, as I talked about before, we had several of those dining areas that penetrated the traversable path. And what we found is that the tree areas and the dining areas were in conflict. So you couldn't get a traversable path to go through there at the proper width and be able to maintain both of them. The sidewalk work in the base design was limited strictly to that area of the sidewalk that needed to be dealt with because of a disruption to another work item. So if we were constructing a ramp to address the vertical differential at one of these entries, we then might very well have to work on the sidewalk, maybe a piece or 2 of sidewalk adjacent to it, to make sure that we didn't have a vertical differential between the sidewalks that would also cause a hazard. Minimal aesthetics, minimal drainage work, and no impacts to the existing trees or streetlights in that option. In number two, you see there in the first item, entries addressed by sidewalk raising, 6-foot wings, in quotes, and limited landings. Sidewalk raising, in the next slide, I'll show you kind of what we're driving at there. But the wings, what I mean by all that is that we have between the edge of the traversable path and the building facade, we have 12 feet, okay? So we can put in a 6-foot traversable path, and then we have another 6 foot between the traversable path and the building facade which I affectionately call the wings, right? So we have a traversable path that's running, straight down the sidewalk. And then on either side, you can go up or down with your sidewalk because you're not impacting the traversable path. As soon as you want to turn and leave that pathway, that's where your 5% comes into play. In this option here, the traversable path was established to maintain the 6-foot width. And we best fit a straight, uniform, traversable path through the entire 2 city blocks. The sidewalk work was much more extensive, and it was done primarily to address some of the vertical differentials, but it was also there to create a uniform appearance. There's several examples out there today where it's concrete, but some is white, some is gray, some is dark gray, and it all has to do with, there may have been some utility work done, which there was. Right? We had some new gas service lines that were put in, and they repaired the concrete walk. But the concrete that they used to repair the walk didn't look exactly like the concrete that was there before, and it serves to detract, in my opinion, with the look of downtown. The parking reconstruction to raise the sidewalk, we also addressed and had money allocated in our submitted budget estimate for contextual aesthetics, form-lined concrete, pigmented colored concrete, as well as some ornamental type railings. We didn't really go into extensive work as it wasn't in our contract or scope to do, picking the types of railing, but we put dollars in there so that knowing that if we had a railing, it would need to be of some, significant context that would be compatible with the city. Similarly, as before, we stayed away from doing anything with the trees and anything with the lighting. So here's what we're talking about when I say raising the sidewalk, or raising the sidewalk raising example. So the dashed line to the left this is a cross section that's taken right out of our survey data. So you can see in that area, and the vertical scale makes it a little hard, but if you kind of see all the way to the far right, we're dimensioning 0.478 feet. So 5 3/4 inches. So for scale purposes, you can see on where I've got the 2% shown, how much that those parking spots dive down at that curb line. What this example is trying to show is that for a 5 3/4 inch differential, we can correct most of that by raising the parking spots to an appropriate grade, right? So in the accessible parking spots, we're doing that. We need to do that because those were non-compliant. In other areas, we can do that same sort of thing to address a lot of the differentials that were in that 5 3/4 and under category. The 5% and the 4.11%, the 4.11% comes right off the existing survey. This cross section was actually at the PMBA building that's just I guess east or south, depending on which direction you want to look, but just kind of down toward the library from Zingos. So that's why 4.11%, that's coming right out of our survey. But this is an example, so, for for your purposes there. And that 4.11 and the 5.0, those numbers can change as you go in to refine what you're seeing there. This is what we came up with for the work items for the two different options. 630, a little over $1 million for the other one, and just as a kind of for your purposes on scale, that budget estimate for option 2 has about 20% of it in for what I call that contextual aesthetic enhancements. So it wouldn't be normally needed, but recognizing that some of that would be desirable. So when we went through, and these are exhibits that are prepared out of our report, and what you see here is with the areas that are kind of in that pinkish color, those are ramps and landing areas, and generally what we found is that we had several instances where you had an entry that was fully compliant, i.e. a green dot, and then directly adjacent to it, and in some cases it would, as a stairway going up to an apartment or offices or whatever, you'd have a set there that would be in that 10-inch range. So what we came up with here is these pink areas was our recommendation on how to address some of those much taller, that 6, 8, 10-inch type vertical differentials. With the brown areas, that's reworking the sidewalk itself. So you can kind of see it like 120 Louisiana. We're showing the brown sidewalk there. That would be just changing the grades on the sidewalk to lift them slightly to meet the thresholds of that building. One of the things, being that this is the base option, you'll also notice, and I'd like to draw your attention to, is the pink ramp that actually turns the corner onto 2nd Street. So there's a stairway as well as a concrete landing area on that corner, and we just felt it was good practice rather than not turning the corner and actually tying those areas together. So that's why you see us turning there. You would have to do the same sort of thing to provide an accessible route to address that vertical differential at that stair landing as well. So we included that with this assumption or this option. Okay. So here's the examples in this of the accessible parking spots. So we have an accessible parking spot, but I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that it's one accessible parking spot, but you actually have to work on 3 to deal with the grades that you're transitioning back into the existing, and also the drainage that is required in that area. These small, somewhat isolated sidewalk pieces on the left side in both of those concrete islands, that addresses those little settlement areas that I talked about earlier. This is the advanced design. Obviously, there's a lot more ground. In the area between Front Street and Second Street, we're suggesting that you consider the diagonal parking, right? That's that sidewalk raising concept that I talked about. It also serves to address and greatly minimize the amount of landings and ramps that are needed in this same section. Now, in this area, which is between Second and the tracks, you notice that we haven't actually recommended that we have the same treatments for the diagonal parking. And that's due to the fact that in these areas, with the exception of the couple of pink areas there, raising the sidewalk really doesn't address the issue, right? We have in several locations, we have a differential that's greater than that 5 3/4 inches. Therefore, addressing and raising all the sidewalk and all that, we still end up with conditions that would not be met with that method. So this is a rendering, photo edit of it's by no means intended to be a design, but really just concepts to show you kind of what I've been presenting. You kind of see over to the left, this being the base design option, right? One of my philosophies was to maintain at all costs the dining outdoor dining areas. So in this case, at the time of our inspection was Casa Berens, they have an outdoor dining area in front of those windows. So you can see just immediately to the left, I show a ramp that's leading up to that tan door. That ramp is perpendicular in nature because immediately to the left there, to the Rose and Thistle, they have a flush entry. So there's no options to present a ramp going left or going right. Therefore, we had to go perpendicular to provide accessibility to that entry. In this rendering, what I was trying to portray, and you may be able to see, but right off the sign and the American flag there, just to the left, I've got an opening in the rail there. That's intended to be a landing, and because we have an outdoor dining area that's immediately to the right of that area also. So we're providing a landing in there, a ramp to get up, to gain access to the three entries that are in that area, because they were all within about a ½ an inch vertically of each other. Another ramp down to the far right in this option. In the advanced design concept and how this differs slightly, in this case we have a constant landing area across this entire area. There's a ramp to the far right, and then I've provided a couple of openings, call them steps, but there's a uniform landing area to provide access to all of these entries along the same corridor. In this option, we would be in conflict, as I mentioned earlier, to those two dining areas that exist at that location. So I mentioned that there were additional considerations that I came up with. I'm nearing my end of my presentation. The first one was the trees. I'm aware that the administration is trying to figure out how to take care of the trees correctly, right? They're very large. In conversation with the service director, they're not able to be pruned in a healthy manner. One of the considerations that maybe something worth looking at is the ability to replace and relocate those existing trees with a tree that's more appropriate to a streetscape type element. In this picture here, you can see that branches are almost touching the building elevation. And that's the case in several different locations where the trees have just gotten very large and dense. Another option that I would mention is the possibility of alternate plantings. Maybe the city would consider a few trees and then some planters. And I guess I'm thinking even a possibility of maybe there's planters that would be forklift friendly that could be utilized to help with some of the outdoor seating and could be moved periodically if a special event were to be hosted downtown. Additional seating options. You kind of see where I've indicated there. This area could be used to a much higher level. If we looked at the alignments and dealt with the trees, because the trees right now are a fairly significant impediment, not only to the cross slopes and the size of their plantings, but also it seems like they're in the exact wrong location for outdoor dining areas. So I tried to show that on there is that, you know, you have approximately 13 feet, which based on what I was seeing with our different areas out there would be adequate for 2 rows of tables. You could do a fairly good size area in there. Third thing was the power. Once again, talking to the service director, I understand that we all love our farmers market, except for the service director, because all the power is undersized and it is routinely breaking circuit, popping circuit breakers and all that sort of thing. This would be an opportunity to, if you're going to be into the trees themselves, you could also talk about providing additional capacity in the electric to support what we're now doing downtown. Parking alternatives. Do we want to continue with the diagonal parking? Do we want to look at perpendicular parking? I know there's been a lot of discussions. I've been party to some of that as well. Parking downtown. Maybe this is an option to revisit that whole area since we're, my suggestion is at least for that one block to redo the parking there. Operational mobility. Do we want to continue the multi-directional left turn lane? Technically, we have diagonal parking that is opposite the direction of traffic, and so we're inviting traffic to make a U-turn in the middle of the road to get over into parking that's over there. The multi-turn or multi-lane directional left turn is really an extension of the left turn lanes that occur at 2nd Street. So it may be something that we want to consider, and that's what I talked about with operational mobility. Pedestrian crossing safety enhancements, audible detection devices, push button, tactile buttons on the crosswalks themselves. And the last one, asphalt resurfacing. Similar to my comments about creating a uniform concrete look across the entire area, we might want to consider a resurfacing at a minimum to provide a uniform look through the entire area. And that, I thank you very much. I hope that was informative. My name, our office is just down the street, so I'm very invested. I've lived in Perrysburg a long time, help. If you have any questions, we've got a few more minutes. I'll field whatever questions. I promise to answer any that I can. How about that?
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate you coming out today and providing this. I'm sure that as council, we always like to have lots of questions, so I'm sure there's going to be quite a few, so be careful what you wish for on that.
Well, we're all in for the best solution. So.
With that, is there anyone who would like to start off with asking some questions? I can go down the line. We can start that way. Or, Mr. McCarthy, you're the one who really pushed for this. So.
At the beginning, Steve, you mentioned this is on the next sheet, accessibility study review. And you use phrases like allowable cross slope, violation of current standards, exceeded longitudinal slope requirements. Not steep danger, so I'm going to put that in too. But where do these? Just give us a sense. Where do the requirements come from? Are they federal guidelines? Are they federal regulations that have force of law? Or?
They're federal in nature. They started out as guidelines, and now they've moved towards. I'm not aware, Tim, of anyone that's being cited for not doing it unless there is a complaint or an accident. I can't really talk to whether they're official federal law, but I do know that they're generally accepted, and if you have a project where federal money is involved in it, you're required to comply.
Steve, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, not to that question.
You concur, okay. Because, I think everyone should know, we've gotten, I think all of us have gotten this much paper on this issue today. And this includes discussions of what are required and the source of those requirements. And obviously, this is going to be a multi-step process to consider this. And we it's my fault, we kind of put the cart before the horse in this sense. There was a presentation made, I think you probably made it, that I know several of the property owners and merchants attended.
This is my first presentation.
There was a presentation
Right.
made, and we got a bunch of comments and questions. And what got us here today is, some of us said, we don't even know what you're talking about. We don't even know what's being suggested or recommended.
Right.
So that's how we got to where we are tonight, just to get a baseline understanding of what we're talking about. But another big part of the equation, though, of course, is what are we absolutely required to do, or is it being recommended to do as either a best practice, or just being recommended to do as an open community. We got to distinguish between those, and we're 7 of us sitting up here, we got to figure that out over the next several months, I guess. So I did want to get a handle on that. I have a bunch of questions, but others should take a shot.
Tim, I guess if I could comment on that, I think we're somewhere between the second and the third. The administration asked us to perform an accessibility survey and come up with geometric concepts from building elevation to building elevation. So what was happening behind that elevation i.e. maybe there's a stairway behind, maybe there's a narrow walkway. That was not what we were charged to look at. I fully acknowledge that in certain instances, we would provide access to the public right-of-way, and that immediately beyond the public right-of-way, there may be an inaccessible route. That was not what we were charged to do.
That's pretty clear. I mean, this doesn't deal with an example that just comes to mind. I don't want to pick on it, but where the Messenger Journal is located now, when it was Mills Hardware, it had a sloping entryway. I don't know if it met all the slope requirements you're talking about.
Right.
Seemed like a wheelchair-bound person to get up there. I don't know, but now they
Yeah,
replaced
that's-
it with a step entry. A wheelchair's not going to get up there, it's going to have to be lifted.
Right.
So those will still exist, because that's, I mean, the city can't force individual property owners to go in and make those changes. I mean,
That's my understanding. I am aware that some communities are encouraging their property owners to come closer to compliance through programs. Some actually utilize their community development block grant funds, with a grant process. So there are communities out there that have dealt with these sorts of situations and are trying to encourage their businesses, their residents in that area. But to my knowledge, there isn't anyone that, you can't require that private business to do that.
Can you name some of those communities, if you know any off the top of your head?
Well, one of the communities that I worked with and did something very similar would be the city of Bryan, right here in Northwest Ohio.
Very northwest corner of Ohio, right?
Yeah, Williams County. They actually utilized, I did a similar project for them. They didn't have as many of the conflicting entries that we have here, but they struggled with the same sorts of concepts. They utilize that sort of, they have, their Chamber of Commerce is right in the center of town. So where the streetscape project that I did, which addressed a lot of these same accessibility issues, were the four corners of their courthouse square, which serves, the center of town there. So Woodville has done, other similar type things.
Well, to show you how confused I was, on sheet number 2, I got myself confused right at the beginning. You said 17 and 26 ramps are not compliant. Now, when I think of ramp, I'm thinking about a place where there's a curb cut that someone could walk up or use a wheelchair to get up. Is that what you mean by ramp?
Well, we have ramps that are at the crosswalks.
Okay.
So a crosswalk has 2 ramps.
Yep.
Okay? So we also have ramps that are at the accessible parking spots. So we have a, when a citizen is using the accessible parking area, there's the striped walkway adjacent that leads to the ramp. So when you start adding those up, it becomes quite significant. And several of those ramps that are off from the accessible parking spots do not have truncated domes. They're not of the compliant dimensions. And in many cases, there's ponding water that sits on those because the drainage, by just the pure nature of how all the geometric configuration is, it doesn't promote water getting to the catch basin to drain properly.
Go ahead. An additional considerations, street trees replace and relocate. Where would you relocate them to? I mean, I got your idea of use smaller trees and planters that would be movable, I guess was the thought. I mean, what do you mean by relocate the street trees?
So I really haven't given enough design consideration there to really allocate specifically. I can share with you that, you know, some of the experiences I've had with other communities, there always seems to be a conflict between the tree and making sure that my name on my business is visible, that, you know, shade is correct. And I think really, Tim, to adequately respond to that, I would have to just say it would need to be studied. Because if you have a smaller tree that's consistent with a streetscape environment, you could place it, say, at a building line that would be separated from the two storefronts. That would also provide an opportunity for some of these outdoor dining establishments. Zingo's doesn't have any railing around their tables. But if you were providing outdoor dining, or just, you know, open up the thought process for a minute, maybe we would have one of our artists downtown that would like to display some of their products, put a case out there or something like that. You could use that area as a supplement to the actual building itself.
And you mentioned parking alternatives. You said consider changing from the vertical, or whatever you call it, lane configuration, parking lane configuration, to perpendicular. How will that help her with accessibility and those sorts of issues?
I didn't, you know, I haven't calculated.
These are your additional considerations. This really wasn't the heart of your study. These were things you said, hey, just think about these things.
But it's also things, right? I'm a citizen too, and so I know, you know, some of the discussions. So when I'm going through all these things, I'm like, hey, you know, why, you know, maybe we should look at this. When you have an angled parking, it facilitates the entry into the parking. But it's very difficult to back out of an angled parking spot, okay? If you chose to just have a perpendicular parking spot, you wouldn't have the diagonal there, so every parking spot would only occupy 9 or 10 feet as opposed to 13 or 14. That's what I'm arriving at there. We're not talking about huge numbers. You know, it might be an increase of, I don't know, 10 or 12. I believe Brian has done some work in that, but you know, that's what I'm alluding to.
So clarification, an increase of 10 to 12 parking spaces if we did that? It's a rough estimate. I'm not holding to it.
Did you have you calculated that?
Not in that area.
So I think it's got to keep our attention on that one.
Yeah, we need parking.
Well, I realize that, you know, and it's always a drawback, right? I mean, you have the diagonal parking, which makes it easy, so, you know, people can slide in there and they don't, you know, detract from the flow of other vehicles there because they're much easier to navigate. But on the flip side, and I saw a lot of head nods when I made that, when you back out, it's a little easier now that we all have cameras in our cars. But you know, 10 years ago, it was very nerve-wracking to back out of there. And now that we've got larger trucks and SUVs, you're into the traffic lane before you really know. Thankfully, we've got a wider lane and we've got that multi-use left turn, so you know, people see you and they can navigate around you.
Just a couple questions.
Sure.
So the wings on each side of the traversable path must not be enough. The slope on those wings must not be enough to accommodate what we need in terms of slope?
So you're limited, if you're gonna use that wing for a traversable route, so to gain access to a building, you're limited to 5%. So in several cases, 5% could get you that yellow dot, but it doesn't get you the orange and the red. Because over that 6-foot area at 5%, you're not able to get the vertical differential.
So that's why you have the railing,
That's right. And
because that would be a step up.
yeah, well, Gary, I'm glad you asked that question. I want to also emphasize to all of you that the railing, you saw the railing in a couple of my renderings. The railing, we're talking about a vertical differential of 8 inches, 10 inches or so. Based on code, that would not require a handrail, right? Because it's not considered a fall hazard per se. The reason I show the railing in the rendering and in some of those graphics is that I believe it's a safety consideration that if I'm walking along the sidewalk up against the building, right? It's not the traversable path, but you can walk up there, and I don't see a 6-inch step, I could very easily, bang my foot into that and take a nose plant. So even though it's not a required element because it doesn't meet the definition of a fall hazard per se, I'm showing a railing of some sort for a vertical queue. Now, that could take, because we don't have the requirement of a railing, it could take a variety of design options, right? Some options that we did in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. We had a similar condition, and we used, this was in more of a naval type aura. We actually had pilasters that were constructed with larger chain link, and I'm talking about 6-inch links, and it was more of an aesthetic element because we didn't need a railing that met the definition of building code with dimensions and that. And we could consider those sorts of things as well, depending, but that would be a design element that, we could think about.
So where the courthouse, I think you said was Bryan,
Yep.
that was on county property?
No, that was a city of Bryan.
Okay.
They have a unique situation there in the sense that the county owns and is responsible for the sidewalk on the interior of the square and the courthouse themselves. I did not have any involvement in the county project. And then the city has responsibility for the sidewalk on the outside of the square where the adjacent businesses are located.
So and you may not know the answer to this, but when the city follows these guidelines or the county follows guidelines, does that make the individual businesses more or less susceptible to allegations or charges of PDA?
I really don't know.
I didn't know if you know that. Because if we do this, it's on behalf of the city, but then there would be maybe a higher expectation for the businesses to follow through on their part.
Yeah, I could see why you might. I really don't know. I mean, I'm public
I
right.
didn't know if that was available in terms of.
I will tell you that what the city of Bryan, what they experienced. Generally, all of the businesses were very excited and appreciative because in addition to having accessible walks to all the property, some of that contextual aesthetic design some really attractive form liner treatments. They had new lights that were put in that not only did they serve to kind of accentuate the historic nature of that square, but also dealt with street lighting on the street and lower pedestrian lighting, so it was a little more sensitive, I guess, to the pedestrian, right? Different light levels. I can't really speak to, what they did or what, the businesses were, forced to do, what they chose to do. But I can say that everybody generally was very happy with. Now, there was disruption during construction. There always is, right? But we took great stride, went into great pains to develop plans, to maintain access and all that. And I presume, Perrysburg would do that here if we went forward with this.
Thank you.
I have a related question, but I think Steve wanted to add something. But this is kind of related to what Barry was just asking. On sheet 4, you show orange dots on, it seemed to be, I'll give an easy example. There's one on singles, and I think these are basically where you got to step up.
Yeah.
I mean, is that, are you just noting that exists, or are you somehow saying the city needs to do something to fix that?
I'm identifying that is a vertical differential in the accessible route. So I'm not saying that, somebody needs to or doesn't need to. Right now, the disability access consultants that did their work in the fall of 2019 and my work that was done in the spring of this year, what we're saying is that if you are walking down the sidewalk, you turn 90 degrees to go into one of these establishments, there's a vertical differential there in the orange criteria, in that 3 to 8 inches. So that is a barrier to an accessible route.
Steve, did you want to
I can clarify a couple of legal issues.
Many of you may know Steve Davis, a lawyer who practices in the ADA area, and he's a lifetime resident of Perrysburg as well.
All right, do you want me to step up there, or did you?
If you can step up and just say your name and address just for the record.
Sure. As Tim indicated, my name is Steve Damon. I'm a lifelong Perrysburg resident.
And address too, sorry.
And my address is 315 East
Thank you.
6th Street. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, I'm not giving legal advice to the city here. That's for your law director to do. I'm not giving legal advice to anybody, actually. But I can say this, which is responsive to a couple of questions. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act is a legal requirement, requires the city, everything that the city does must be accessible. That's what Mr. Way has told you with the right-of-way. The right-of-way has to be accessible. Parking spaces, crosswalks, those standards, accessibility standards, are published and have been published for decades by the U.S. Department of Justice, and all federal monies require compliance with them. So if you want to argue with the federal government that you're compliant now and that your streets and so forth are accessible, fine, go ahead, add it, but they may very well take away all your money that you've received over the last, several years. Title III, and this is my point, Title III of the ADA covers business owners. Business owners are also required to have their facilities fully accessible to people with disabilities. So whereas the city's obligation might stop, at the right-of-way edge, the business owners or the property owners, I shouldn't say that, the business owner and the property owner, jointly and severally, are responsible for making sure that their business that anybody, the public, can get into and out of the building to the public way. As Mr. Way indicated, the city cannot tell business owners to do that. What I was impressed with from a legal standpoint is he has basically, if you did the full, what you call it, the enhanced version, a lot of that brings people into compliance, the private building owners, and they don't have to spend a nickel. If you do the bare bones minimum, and there are still steps that are not compliant and so forth into some buildings, somebody in this room is going to have to start spending their own money to comply with Title III, which is private businesses, which is not part of this project, but helps out, I think. That's all I want.
Can I ask you a question,
Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah. Not legal advice, but go ahead. Yeah.
Would you think that then the city is required to do this? If we did nothing, it's just the way it's been for the last 3 decades. Is it until we actually do work, then it has to be in compliance?
No, it's got to be compliant right now. Your sidewalks have to be fully compliant right now. Yeah.
Yes, I get that, yes.
And your parking spaces and your slopes and everything. Yeah.
But any work that we do, that's when they're saying it absolutely has to be done. Or, I know they have to be compliant now.
If we're grandfathered in until such time as we actually physically
Do some work?
the project.
That's something in the private
That's
sphere.
exactly what I was.
In private construction, industrial facilities and so forth, that's an area I don't know anything about, but there are many areas where you don't have to do anything now. But if you start to do construction, then you must make it compliant thereafter. That is not true for the public space.
If I can follow up on that, because according to the United States Access Board, it says the board's aim is to make it accessible for persons with disability in a newly built or altered right of way. Is that incorrect in what I'm reading from their board?
I don't think that's an incorrect reading. I'm not sure what section you're talking about, but presently speaking, everything has to. All public facilities need to be accessible. So, for example, let's say we didn't have any curb cuts anywhere in the city. I think you're going to have to you would have to make curb cuts, even if you weren't doing any sewer work. And cities have been sued for not having appropriate lanes of travel, accessible routes. Yeah.
So that even, we're kind of going back and forth here.
Good talking.
But would that even apply for areas that don't even have sidewalks in the community? They have to.
Sure, but the Department of Justice is not going to sue you if you have a half-inch couple of blocks of city pavement that are half-inch off. That's just not what their effort.
John, specific to that point from an engineering side, there are communities that have implemented contracts to go around putting in ramps at all of their crosswalks.
Right.
And they didn't do that because they were required to do that, or that they needed or desired to do that. They were doing that because if they didn't, they were at risk of losing any federal monies, or worse yet, if somebody tripped and fell, and it was deemed, hey, they fell at a location that didn't have adequate ramps for them, that obviously puts that community at a much higher exposure.
It's also the U.S. Access Board just provides standards. It doesn't enforce any laws. Right. Department of Justice doesn't.
And from what I understand, though, is the U.S. Access Board usually has higher standards than what the federal does. Am I incorrect in that? Read through some of the stuff on there, but
I think they're in tandem, right? The Access Board is there to, as he mentions, they're there to promote, they're there to educate, and they're there to continually move the standards forward, in this regard. But my understanding, and I'm not the lawyer, but my understanding is that they're not legal. They're intended to encourage and build the standards that the law community then utilizes as, judgments.
Good question. It's going to be more directed towards you, Steve.
Should I stay on?
Don't run away.
Yeah, well,
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So we're talking about doing work on the right of way, right? And a lot of these orange dots and red dots and yellow, we're talking about the entryways to the business. So it's I would venture a guess that that's where our right of way stops, right? And we're bringing it up to the level where the entryway is, right? So if we were to just focus purely on doing the bare minimum, like you said, where we reworked our ramps for the sidewalk and our parking spaces and the grading for the water, and we didn't address the entryways at all, that would fall more in Title III for the business owner to make,
Yes.
hey, we did our job, we provided the sidewalks that the people with disabilities can use. Now they're having trouble getting into your business because you have a step. Would that?
well, that's exactly right, but I
Okay.
wouldn't say now they're having trouble. I mean, they are now.
Right. So
But it's not your,
so
the city's issue.
I'm just trying to frame the project in my head. It's almost, if I'm looking at this, we're almost taking on this project as a way to get that entryway so it's level, so it's accessible, and then once they get into that business, that's kind of up to the business owner. But it almost seems like we're biting off a huge project that can make it a lot easier for these businesses to be compliant, which is that a fair analysis of that?
I'll let Mr. Way answer it. My, reading of it is that the enhanced project, the second option, would go a long way towards helping the downtown business owners and building owners to be compliant.
And not
Yes.
necessarily the city being, we can be compliant with
You
that.
could be compliant with the first option.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I get that I'm ignoring a whole host of issues about shutting down business entryways and stuff to take on the project. But I just wanted to section it from that.
The other thing, Councilman, is that there's also precedent. So anytime that you have a public improvement that requires a right-of-way acquisition, I realize that isn't what we're talking about, but these steps are an encroachment, right, in the public right-of-way. So ODOT gets involved anytime that you have a right-of-way component. One of the aspects that I confirmed with Bowling Green is our jurisdiction here. ODOT currently has a memo that was drafted about 7 or 8 years ago that they tell me is still enforced today that deals with these sorts of encroachments, right? So most likely these steps were available or put long before accessibility guidelines, long before any of this, right? But that doesn't dismiss the fact that the guidelines are there, the laws are there, section 2 and 3, and that we should come into compliance. The code, and I believe it's written to the effect, and you saw it in that couple of those exhibits that I took from those standards. If you are physically not able to come into compliance, you can get a variance. But as I've proven here, that's not the case. We can come into full compliance. In some instances, there may be situations where the constraints just physically don't allow you to do that. And that's where you come into elevators or lifts or other things of that nature that also might not be applicable. But to run along the course of, well, we're going to maintain a non-compliant facility, I really think is a bad judgment, because there's precedent throughout the country of people that have chosen to do that, and it became a huge problem for the community or for the private businesses themselves.
And so it almost seems like the ADA and you probably know the full history. It seems like it was something that was passed without much funding to do it. Maybe there's grants and stuff, but that's why it lacks enforcement for such a period of time.
Well,
And then it gets enforcement problem.
it does not lack enforcement.
Okay.
It started out as a guideline to encourage people, and then as it became more prevalent, then it became a requirement. As he mentions, there is enforcement happening every day.
It's mainly complaint based, I would assume.
Pardon me?
It's mainly complaint based.
Well,
Enforcement.
the enforcement is often led by private advocacy agencies like Ability Centers. I'm not saying the Toledo Ability Center, although they have been a plaintiff in many lawsuits against the city of Toledo and others. But there is enforcement going on, but I think, I don't know, this is beyond my area, but I think there's federal money out there, federal, state money, to do these kinds of improvements. So not every dollar that the city would have to pay for this has to come out of the city. I mean, I think you can apply for grants.
If I could ask a quick question on that note, because looking over the budget that was proposed for 2023, I don't even know what year it is anymore. I noticed that there was some of the fund in there said, I think, CIC grants.
Yes, the city has an improvement corporation, and that houses the revolving loan fund.
Okay.
And the revolving loan fund dollars are eligible to make ADA improvements in the public right of way with the passage of legislation by city council.
Okay, so that's where those funds are
Yes.
being looked to come from, is, I'm assuming, eliminate the revolving fund.
I don't know if it would eliminate it, but it would certainly draw down on that balance.
He is also accurate is that there are grants out there for complete streets. Okay, so a lot of the attributes, those additional considerations would go a long way to a complete street type concept. In addition to the city's own loan fund there are state and federal grants that. I would think this project would be looked at fairly attractively because of the prominency of the downtown business area and all that. But obviously we'd have to go through an application process and scoring. But there are definitely sources out there.
Have you ever heard of grants that would help the business owners who may not lose business over a big project like this?
I haven't necessarily heard directly for those sorts of sources. I can tell you in the example there in Bryan that I cited is that they use some of their community development block grant funds, which would be federal and state monies towards that. A lot of times, and I guess Mark, I'm just going to kind of a hypothetical out here because I'm pretty invested in this industry, but I don't have a factual basis. But I'll just share with you, one of the options that could be considered is a private business, participating with the city, right? And the city consider a cost sharing, a private share and a public share, but the city fund or apply for a larger grant amount to cover that. There is precedence for those sorts of things, but you're kind of getting into an area that I write a lot of grants. This one I haven't come across this sort of thing. But there's also in working to the benefit of Perrysburg and all of our citizens, there are some ways that the private businesses could get some funding. We just have to dig and find them. The other example, our county economic development folks and Port Authority, they have also funding mechanisms that are available to private businesses.
Do you have any information, and maybe this is a question more for Bridget, on reading through things? I was trying to kind of prep for tonight. I've always just heard kind of mention of complaints, but no specifics since I've been on council of what those complaints actually are. So I want to have a basic understanding, because I've been downtown before where I've seen a disabled person not be able to go into the business, you'll see them waiting outside. But I've never seen it with the right-of-way, really. I haven't seen the issues with the right-of-way. So what are some of the complaints we've received? And then also, does this eliminate that, or is this something we're trying to do to encourage the businesses to, like, is that where the complaints really lie?
The ones that I'm aware of, and I'm aware of some of them through the Ability Center, and Katie Hunt Thomas was here just a moment ago. She's the legal counsel for the Ability Center. It's mainly based on not being able to get into buildings that have that step.
Okay.
Not so much as Steve Wade was mentioning, not to confuse the Steves, not so much like, that half-inch lip or a three-quarter inch lip. It's people who are in wheelchairs who cannot access the stairs to get inside buildings. Those are the complaints that are.
Okay, so this would, raising that up and having the ramps would solve at least that.
It
And then we
would
have
appear to be the case, yes.
potential other issues.
And I can certainly follow up with Ms. Thomas to see if there were any other types of complaints, but mainly it's been that type of complaint.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we're focused on the right things, because if we're spending $1 million and it's not even going to solve the original complaint, we might be better invested in putting together,
I will reach
packages
out
for
and have a
businesses.
conversation with her, and then I'll send all the council an email following up.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Corey, I guess it would also, I think would be helpful, the cross slope to have a compliant traversal path is 2%. The general layperson walking down the sidewalk could probably not discern whether they were on a 3 or 4% versus a 2%. And I think just because somebody hasn't complained doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessarily compliant or okay, right? I just want to make sure.
Oh, no, and I fully understand that. I'm looking at this, hey, if we're going to spend $1 million, what's the best way to spend it?
Yep, yep.
Aspect, so.
Any other questions?
Just one, a piece that I missed is something Steve Stewart mentioned, how if we do the advanced design, it for all intents and purposes removes the business's responsibility or liability piece. And so what is, and I understand there's a difference in design, but how does that go from taking care of just Title II, for the most part, taking care of Title III? And I don't understand.
He started talking about Title II and Title III. I stick to the engineering code. But what I can tell you, Barry, is that in the more enhanced options, what we were looking to accomplish is not only access to all of the businesses, all those entryways, but we were also looking to maintain the traversable path in a consistent manner, okay, rather than jogging all over. So when you talk about the differences between the base option and the more advanced option, we're providing access to these businesses, but we may be providing it in a manner that, is acceptable, but not really desirable. And when you do that, that's where some of the responsibility might shift to the private business, because now they have a ramp leading up to their property, and they need to focus on handrails, for instance, and landings inside the door. There's all sorts of other items that they might need to comply with, that with the enhanced version, and you have a landing right out in front of their entry, you don't have those same concerns, because there is that flat surface that's right at the threshold to the door.
Just one
Yep.
Barry, I think specifically, if I'm understanding this correctly, on slide 2, entryway to Casa Barons, you have 2 orange dots, which indicates moderate work is required. And then if you go to advanced design concept number 2, I think with that, the way you're designing that ramp structure outside, the Casa Barons building then does largely become accessible.
Correct. Yes, exactly right. And what I mentioned also is what made this assignment especially challenging is that we have a number of entries where you have a large, an orange or red dot immediately adjacent to a green dot. There's several locations like that. And so to provide access to a step that is 8 to 10 inches when you can't go either direction with a ramp, right? That's kind of in that example there of the tan door. You're forced to go perpendicular, and because you had I believe in that case it was a 10-inch vertical differential, and if you're required to maintain, which we are, a 5% running slope, you do the calculations, it requires a ramp that's, pushing about 15, 18 feet.
You have a question? Well, can I ask another question? Sure. Would it be, do we have to choose between concept 1 and concept 2, or can be a mixture of the two where it wouldn't have such an impact on the historical aesthetics, or possibly even, or the dining, the outdoor dining? Can there, are you presenting this as just either or?
No, there's always options, right? What the city asked me to do was provide 2 concepts. With everything, once you get into a more detailed design process, there's always ways that can be refined. I think, Mark, the way I would put this, and Brian, if I've misspoke, hit me in the back of the head, but I think that what this study, there were primarily 2 items that I think the city was looking to get out of me for on this assignment. One was to confirm what the disability access consultants did, right? A quote second opinion, which I believe they got, and the second was to establish a budget, because I believe the administration felt like the estimate that was performed prior was not adequate based on their knowledge of construction in this region. How, in that, just north of $1 million, how that $1 million is spent, would be determined during a design process. But it establishes in my opinion, a reasonable sum of money to accomplish what I believe needs to be accomplished. But how that, we're much earlier in the process than that. This by no means indicates these are the only scenarios.
Okay, that's good to know. Because I was thinking maybe in some areas where it's not affecting dining, you could maintain the 6-foot traversable path, but then in other areas it might have to jog and go down to 5 foot. Can it be 6 foot in some areas and 5 foot in others?
Not desirable, but you could, I believe, consider a 5 foot, say, between front and second, and a 6 foot between second and third. You could do that. There was one area that caught my attention as I was preparing for this, and that is the area directly outside of Swig. Swig has the covered area to the side of their building, and then they also have the area out front. That's an example where that outside dining, or I believe they use it as a seating, waiting area. that is in direct conflict with any sort of traversable path around there because we have other features. I believe there's a tree over there and some, maybe like a manhole or I can't remember the exact, but I remember looking at that to where we physically can't get a 5-foot width, which I would deem as our minimum we should consider. We couldn't even get it to fit in the space available.
I think I read the tree plantings right now are 10 by 10 plus another 1 foot of the slope border around it, right?
Yeah.
So like 12?
They vary in size, but most of them are 10 by 12 with a 1 foot concrete curb.
Those could be reduced considerably, couldn't they, and still
Typically,
tree alive.
people, communities are using 5 by 5 tree grates.
5 by 5.
5 by 5.
All right. And that would maybe help keep some of our outdoor dining if we could do something like that.
Well, and as in the additional considerations, that was kind of what I was getting at. I think we could actually increase the number of outdoor dining seats with some of this work. I mean, it wasn't part of what the city tasked me to do, but to try to be prepared and responsive to all of your time. I went a little bit beyond, and it was kind of looking at my drawings again, and wow, if we didn't have this tree right here, we could put dining in this area. No, that's like twice as large as Zingo's tables. I was doing that kind of math, definitely something that could be considered in the design process.
Thank you, Steve.
That's actually one of my big takeaways with this is we have the two concepts there, but I think there's some adjustments. And what has me peaked on over everything is just the possibility of having 10, 12 parking spaces. So I think that's a whole different. That's what they talk about ADA. I like that thought altogether. And personally, I think that we should take a little bit more time just to go through some of these additional considerations and have some conversations to see what we can do to find that.
Do we anticipate a steering committee with the downtown business owners? Or I guess
We've met with them a couple times over the last couple years. Steve mentioned this project actually started in 2019. So it has been a few years, but we've recently met with building owners and tenants and gave them an overview. I think Brian gave them that overview or tried to give the overview. But we haven't gotten to the point where we know which direction council's looking at to determine what those next steps are. Is it getting to the point where there's a conceptual design and then rolling it out to the public like in an open house setting? So we haven't fine-tuned that yet. But once we kind of know what direction that we're going in, I think that can help us look at the next steps in terms of communication with the public.
And then, do you have any idea, and I'm just going to throw out, like farmers market, for instance, where we have booths lined up, what kind of impact would it have on events like that draw people to downtown businesses?
Well, I think overall, if you eliminated the steep slopes in the diagonal parking area, I think it would be easier to navigate some of those areas, even for able-bodied people. And I think as you're going through the design process, you think about all those sorts of things. So I mentioned the ability of planters that might be portable. The trees, whether they be the trees that we have or a 5 by 5 tree grate, the one thing they aren't is portable. And so what I did with the city of Bryan on that project is we looked at the calendar, the city's calendar. We looked at all of the different activities. They have a lot of concerts in the square. We would do the same sorts of things if Fishbeck was retained to do the design activity. Surely there would be impacts, but I think what the process would be is that the positive impacts would outweigh the negatives because you're going in thinking about farmers market, thinking about the parades down, all of those sorts of things you factor in as you're designing the job itself.
And I know we're well over time here, and no, I'm going to, surprised I got a text message yet. But it's going to, there's nothing else here. And thank you, Steve, for coming out and your presentation here today. I really appreciate it. It gives us a little better idea of what's going on. I know there's going to be some further conversation with County Council. I like some of the additional considerations that you mentioned, and I'm hoping that we can have some conversations on what the next steps are going to be. And for the business owners here who are here today and the building owners, please come to our next council meeting if you have anything that you would like to add in or have any questions you would like us to look into, so that way we can get that, or shoot us an email so we can get some information and try to hopefully chase it down. This is the first for many of us to actually see and understand what's going on here today. None of us knew. I didn't say none of us, but the majority of us didn't really know what we had in front of us here today.
So,
I'm aware of the ADA compliance from my ODOT years.
and then just,
Is this assigned to a committee or?
I believe that this is the service committee right now. Am I correct in that?
and then logistically, what would be the next thing that council would see in front of it? Would it be like approval of next phase?
I think what we talked about in the last service committee meeting was having, suspending any conversations with that committee until this presentation happened. So I think it would be back on Councilman Attorney's agenda for this one, for further discussion by that committee.
Okay, as to what the next steps are.
And if there's additional information or questions that we can then respond to.
I look forward to hearing about Brian's plan for making straight parking if it's an action. I'm going to bring it up a few times. So, but no, I thank you very much. If there is no objections, we will consider this council meeting adjourned.
Thank you very much for your time.